The black woman sold herself to pay off debts until the cowboy said, "She's mine." Her trembling hands gripped the auction platform as desperate voices called out bids for 7 years of her labor. The crowd saw only another broken soul crushed by circumstance, whispering that she'd disappear into endless servitude like so many before her. They assumed her fate was sealed, a lifetime of invisible toil under the scorching frontier sun. Then the giant cowboy stepped forward from the shadows, his weathered face set with dangerous determination, clutching gold coins that would bind their destinies together in ways neither anticipated. What they didn't know was that her education held secrets that could topple the corrupt system, enslaving dozens of families, while his own tragic past made him the perfect ally, or her greatest vulnerability. Would his intervention save them both, or destroy the only chance for justice this territory had ever seen? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The morning sun cast long shadows across the small wooden cross that marked Samuel Washington's grave. Celeste knelt beside the fresh dirt, her calloused fingers tracing the carved letters of her father's name. 3 months had passed since pneumonia claimed the only family she had left in this world. She pulled the crumpled medical bill from her apron pocket. $500. The number seemed impossible, like counting stars in the desert sky. Her father had been a teacher before the war, educating freed slaves in secrecy. Now his daughter faced a debt that could destroy everything he had worked to build. The sound of approaching horses made her stomach clench. Silas Blackwood rode up with 2 armed men flanking him. His expensive suit looked out of place in the small cemetery, but his smile was all business. "Miss Washington, time to settle accounts." Celeste stood slowly, brushing dirt from her worn dress. "Mr. Blackwood, I told you I need more time. Time costs money. Interest compounds daily." He dismounted and produced a thick document. Original debt was $160. Medical care, medicine, funeral expenses, fair and documented. She stared at the papers. The numbers swam before her eyes, but she could see how they had grown. Interest rates that doubled every month, late fees that appeared like magic, administrative costs that made no sense. This can't be legal. Perfectly legal. Territorial law is quite clear on debt collection. Blackwood's voice carried the confidence of a man who had done this many times before. "You have 24 hours, $500, or you enter indentured servitude." The words hit her like a physical blow. 7 years of labor to pay off a debt that had somehow tripled in 3 months. She had heard whispers of other families trapped in similar arrangements, but seeing the contract made it real. "I don't have that kind of money." "Then you know what comes next." Blackwood remounted his horse. "Tomorrow at noon, Town Square. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." After they left, Celeste returned to her father's cabin. The small space felt enormous in its emptiness. She moved to the loose floorboard near the fireplace and retrieved the hidden wooden box beneath. Inside lay her father's teaching certificate and her own papers from the Northern Seminary School. She had attended classes disguised as a servant girl, invisible to the other students but absorbing every lesson. Mathematics, Latin, literature, and law. Her father had risked everything to give her an education that most women, let alone women of her background, could never dream of obtaining. Now those papers felt worthless. Education meant nothing when faced with legal documents that could steal away her freedom. That evening, she sat by candlelight reading through one of her father's law books. The text was dense and complex, but she had learned to navigate legal language during her seminary years. Somewhere in these pages might be an answer, a loophole, anything that could help her escape Blackwood's trap. The next morning came too quickly. Celeste walked through Redemption Creek toward the town square, her head held high despite the whispers that followed her. Some faces showed sympathy, but most displayed the cold calculation of people watching a business transaction. The wooden platform stood in the center of the square like a stage waiting for its final performance. Blackwood stood beside it with his papers and his satisfied smile. Judge Martha Stern observed from the courthouse steps, her expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blackwood called out, "legal debt collection as authorized by territorial statute, 7 years service to satisfy financial obligation." Celeste climbed the steps to the platform. Her hands trembled, but she kept her chin raised. The crowd grew larger as word spread. She recognized the Martinez family, who owed money for their son's broken leg. Old Mr. Thompson, whose farm was mortgaged beyond hope. The widow Patterson, whose husband's burial costs had somehow multiplied into an impossible burden. They all watched to see if resistance was possible, or if submission was the only path forward. "Bidding starts at $500 for 7 years' labor," Blackwood announced. Voices called out from the crowd. A ranch owner offered room and board plus basic wages. The hotel keeper bid slightly higher, mentioning kitchen work and cleaning. Each bid felt like another chain being forged. Then a different voice cut through the noise. 500. Gold. A tall cowboy stepped forward from the back of the crowd. His weathered face showed years of hard living, but his eyes burned with quiet intensity. He wore simple clothes and carried himself like a man accustomed to standing alone against opposition. The crowd fell silent as he approached the platform. His boots struck the wooden steps with deliberate precision. When he reached the top, he pulled a leather pouch from his coat and poured gold coins into his palm. "She's mine." The words rang across the square with absolute finality. Blackwood's smile widened as he counted the gold, but something flickered in the cowboy's expression that suggested this transaction was far from over. The cowboy's ranch sat 3 miles outside Redemption Creek, a modest spread with weathered buildings and sturdy fences. Jacob Morrison led Celeste through the front door without ceremony, his boots echoing on the wooden floors. "Kitchen's through there. Bedroom upstairs. You can take the small room at the end of the hall." Celeste nodded, still processing the rapid change in her circumstances. The house felt lived in but neglected, like a man had been managing alone for too long. "What exactly do you expect from me?" Jacob paused at the kitchen doorway. "Cooking, cleaning, basic household management, nothing more complicated than that." She followed him into the kitchen and stopped short. Papers covered every surface. Bills, receipts, legal documents, and ledgers created a chaotic landscape of financial confusion. Some papers had fallen to the floor and been stepped on repeatedly. "This is your record keeping. Never been good with numbers." Jacob grabbed a coffee pot from the stove. Had someone helping before, but they moved on. Celeste stared at the mess. Her fingers itched to organize the chaos, but she forced herself to look away. Revealing her abilities too quickly could create complications she wasn't ready to handle. That evening, Jacob left for town business. Celeste waited until his horse disappeared down the road before returning to the kitchen. She couldn't help herself. The disorganization was painful to witness. She started with the bills, sorting them by date and vendor. The pattern that emerged made her stomach clench. Jacob was being systematically overcharged for basic supplies, feed prices that fluctuated wildly, equipment repairs billed twice for the same work, interest rates on loans that climbed without explanation. The handwriting on several documents looked familiar, too familiar. Celeste found a lantern and spread the papers across the kitchen table. Her seminary training had taught her to spot inconsistencies in contracts and financial records. The mathematical errors weren't accidental. They followed the same pattern she had seen in her own father's medical bills. Silas Blackwood's signature appeared on half the documents. She worked through the night, creating neat piles and calculating totals. The numbers told a story of deliberate exploitation spanning months. Jacob Morrison was being bled dry by the same system that had trapped her family. When Jacob returned the next morning, he found Celeste asleep at the kitchen table, surrounded by organized stacks of papers. She had written calculations in the margins of several documents and created a summary sheet showing monthly expenses versus income. "What is this?" Celeste jerked awake, momentarily disoriented. The evidence of her work spread across the table like an accusation. She had revealed too much too quickly. I was just trying to organize things for you. Jakob picked up the summary sheet. His eyes widened as he read her calculations. You can do mathematics like this. There was no point in lying. The proof sat before them in neat columns and careful handwriting. My father taught me. Your father was a teacher before the war. After freedom came, he educated anyone willing to learn. He said knowledge was the only thing nobody could steal from you. Jakob studied the papers more carefully. These calculations, they're saying I'm being overcharged for everything. By approximately 40% across all categories. Celeste pointed to specific line items. Feed costs, equipment repairs, loan interest. The pattern is consistent. How do you know this? Celeste hesitated. Revealing her seminary education would raise questions she wasn't prepared to answer. But Jakob's expression showed genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. I attended school in the North for 2 years. I learned bookkeeping and basic law. Basic law, enough to recognize predatory lending practices. She pointed to one of the loan documents. This interest calculation violates territorial lending statutes. The compounding schedule is illegal. Jakob sat down heavily in the kitchen chair. You're telling me I'm being cheated? Systematically. For months, Celeste gathered her courage. The same way my family was cheated. The silence stretched between them as Jakob processed this information. Outside, mourning birds called to each other across the desert landscape, oblivious to the human drama unfolding in the small kitchen. Show me how you know this. For the next hour, Celeste walked Jakob through each document. She explained compound interest calculations, pointed out altered dates, and demonstrated how fees had been added without authorization. Her seminary professors had drilled these concepts into their students, preparing them to navigate a world that would try to take advantage of their inexperience. Jakob listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification on legal terms. His questions were intelligent and focused, suggesting a mind capable of understanding complex concepts, despite his earlier claims about being bad with numbers. If this is all true, then other families are probably facing the same problem. More than probably, Celeste thought of the faces she had seen at the auction. The Martinez family, Mr. Thompson, the widow Patterson. They all owe money to the same creditors using the same contract language. You could help them. The suggestion hung in the air between them. Celeste felt the weight of possibility and danger in equal measure. Helping other families would mean exposing her abilities publicly. It would mean taking on Silas Blackwood directly. That would be risky. Everything worth doing is risky. Jakob stood and walked to the window overlooking his land. Question is whether you're willing to use what you know to help people who need it. Celeste looked at the organized papers spread across the table. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her that education without action was just another form of slavery. Word spread quietly through Redemption Creek that Jakob Morrison's hired woman knew something about numbers and contracts. The first family approached on a Tuesday evening when shadows grew long across the desert. Maria Martinez knocked softly on the ranch house door, her husband Carlos standing nervously behind her. Their 8-year-old son had broken his leg falling from a horse 3 months ago. The medical bills had grown into something monstrous. We heard you might be able to help us understand our papers. Celeste invited them into the kitchen where she had been reviewing Jakob's corrected accounts. The Martinez family's documents told the same familiar story. A $50 medical bill had transformed into a $200 debt through creative mathematics and compounding interest. This late fee structure violates territorial statutes. Celeste pointed to a clause buried in small print. And this interest rate exceeds legal limits by 15%. Carlos leaned forward, squinting at the numbers. You can prove this. The territorial code is specific about medical debt collection. Your creditor is required to provide itemized billing and cannot compound interest on fees. Celeste pulled out one of Jacob's law books and found the relevant statute. This section here makes their current contract unenforceable. Maria's eyes filled with tears of relief. What can we do? Document everything. Make copies of all papers. File a formal dispute with the territorial clerk within 30 days of receiving notice. Celeste wrote out the specific steps on a piece of paper. The burden of proof shifts to them once you challenge the debt formally. The Martinez family left with their documents organized and a clear plan of action. Word of their visit reached other struggling families within days. Old Mr. Thompson arrived on Friday morning, his arthritic hands shaking as he spread his farm mortgage papers across the kitchen table. The original loan had been reasonable, but modifications and refinancing had created a labyrinth of obligations that threatened to consume his land. Been farming this property for 20 years. Now they're saying I owe more than it's worth. Celeste studied the mortgage modifications carefully. Each document showed the same pattern of exploitation she had learned to recognize. Fees added without notification, interest calculations that defied mathematical logic, payment schedules designed to ensure default. Your original mortgage was sound. These modifications were added without proper legal notification. She pointed to missing signatures and altered dates. Under territorial property law, you can challenge any modification that wasn't properly witnessed and recorded. How do you know all this? The question came up frequently now. Celeste had developed a careful response that revealed enough to establish credibility without exposing the full extent of her education. My father taught school. I learned to read legal documents helping him with administrative work. It was true enough to satisfy most inquiries while protecting her from more dangerous scrutiny. Mr. Thompson left with his papers reorganized and a letter template for challenging the illegal modifications. Within 2 weeks, his mortgage had been restored to its original terms, saving his farm from foreclosure. The widow Patterson came next, struggling with her husband's funeral costs that had somehow multiplied into a crushing burden. Then the blacksmith's family, trapped by equipment loan terms that violated standard commercial lending practices. Each case followed the same pattern of systematic exploitation. Celeste worked primarily in the evenings, maintaining the appearance of performing household duties during daylight hours. Jacob supported her efforts by providing law books and serving as a witness for document signings. Their partnership had evolved into something neither had expected. You're building something important here, Jacob said one evening as Celeste prepared correspondence for 3 different families. My father always said education was meant to be shared. Knowledge hoarded becomes useless. What did he teach you about taking on powerful people? Celeste paused in her writing. That truth backed by law is stronger than corruption backed by money, but it requires patience and careful preparation. She had been documenting everything: names, dates, amounts, contract terms, witness statements. The pattern of exploitation extended far beyond individual cases. Silas Blackwood and his associates had created a systematic operation designed to trap families in cycles of debt. By the end of the month, Celeste had helped 12 families challenge fraudulent debts totaling over $3,000. Her reputation spread through whispered conversations and careful recommendations. People began referring to her as someone who could read the law and make sense of complicated papers. The success brought new risks. Silas Blackwood had built his operation on the assumption that his victims lacked the knowledge to fight back effectively. Celeste's intervention threatened the foundation of his business model. She noticed the increased attention during her trips to town for supplies. Conversations stopped when she passed. Eyes followed her movements with new intensity. Some looks carried respect, but others showed suspicion and resentment. People are talking about you, Jacob warned after returning from the general store. What kind of talking? Mixed reactions. Families you've helped are grateful, but others think you're stirring up trouble that should be left alone. Celeste understood the dynamics at work. Her success challenged assumptions about who could possess legal knowledge and use it effectively. Some people found this threatening to their established view of how society should function. More concerning were the rumors that Silas Blackwood had begun asking questions about her background and education. His initial dismissal of her as an ignorant servant was giving way to dangerous curiosity about her true capabilities. That evening, Celeste sat at the kitchen table reviewing case files and considering her options. She had helped individual families, but the larger system of exploitation remained intact. Taking on Blackwood directly would require evidence, allies, and careful legal strategy. Jacob found her there past midnight, surrounded by documents and calculations. You're planning something bigger. The individual cases are just symptoms. The real problem is systematic fraud affecting dozens of families. Celeste gestured to her organized files. Someone needs to challenge the entire operation. That someone being you. I might be the only one positioned to do it effectively. The weight of responsibility settled between them like a physical presence, heavy with possibility and danger. Silas Blackwood arrived at the ranch on a Thursday morning with two companions, and a folder thick with official-looking documents. Celeste watched from the kitchen window as they dismounted, their expensive clothes and polished boots announcing serious business. Jacob met them at the front porch, his hand resting casually on his belt. The conversation was brief but heated. Celeste could see tension in Jacob's shoulders as Blackwood gestured toward the house with theatrical authority. "Miss Washington," Blackwood called out. "A word, if you please." Celeste stepped onto the porch, keeping her expression neutral despite her racing heart. Blackwood's smile carried the same predatory confidence she remembered from the auction, but his eyes showed new calculation. "Interesting reports reaching my office. Stories about contract advice and legal interpretations." He opened his folder with deliberate ceremony. Curious thing for someone with no formal education. "I help people read their papers. Nothing more complicated than that. Reading is one thing. Understanding territorial statutes is quite another." Blackwood produced a document from his folder. "This is a formal complaint alleging fraud in several debt collection cases. Your signature appears as witness on multiple disputed contracts." The paper looked official enough to be dangerous. Celeste scanned the legal language quickly, recognizing the trap being constructed around her activities. Practicing law without proper licensing carries serious penalties under territorial code. Fines, imprisonment, permanent prohibition from legal practice. Blackwood's voice carried the satisfaction of a man playing a winning hand. Of course, these charges could be reconsidered if certain disruptive activities were to cease immediately. Jacob stepped forward, his presence shifting the dynamic on the porch. "You're threatening her for helping people understand their contracts. I'm explaining legal realities to someone who appears confused about her proper place in this community." The words hung in the desert air like a physical challenge. Celeste felt the weight of everything she had built over the past month balanced against the threat of systematic destruction. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Simple arrangement. You return to appropriate domestic duties. The families you've advised accept their original contract terms without further dispute. Everyone moves forward without unnecessary complications." Blackwood's companions nodded approvingly, their confidence suggesting they had orchestrated similar conversations before. This was how the system protected itself, through carefully applied pressure that avoided direct confrontation. "And if I refuse, then territorial law takes its course. Fraud charges, legal penalties, public disgrace." Blackwood closed his folder with finality. "Your choice, Miss Washington, cooperation or consequences." After they left, Celeste and Jacob sat in the kitchen reviewing the formal complaint. The document was professionally prepared and legally sound within its limited interpretation of territorial statutes. Blackwood had identified genuine vulnerabilities in her position. "He's not wrong about the licensing requirements," Celeste admitted reluctantly. "Providing legal advice without formal admission to practice violates territorial codes. But helping people read their contracts isn't practicing law." The line gets blurry when you start interpreting statutes and challenging debt calculations in formal proceedings. Celeste set down the complaint with frustration. He's found a way to use the legal system against itself. Word of Blackwood's visit spread through the community within hours. The family Celeste had helped began receiving similar visits from official-looking men carrying threatening documents. The message was clear and coordinated. Maria Martinez arrived at the ranch that evening with tears in her eyes and shaking hands. They say if we don't accept the original debt terms, they'll file criminal charges against you for fraud. We can't let that happen. Old Mr. Thompson came the next day with similar news. The widow Patterson sent her son with a note explaining that she couldn't risk Celeste's safety for her own financial problems. One by one, the families Celeste had helped were being pressured to abandon their challenges and accept Blackwood's terms. "They're using your success against you," Jacob observed after the latest visitor departed, "making you choose between helping people and protecting yourself." Celeste stared at the case files she had compiled so carefully over the past month. Dozens of families trapped in fraudulent debt cycles, their hopes pinned on legal challenges that were now crumbling under systematic pressure. The town's attitude toward her shifted noticeably during her next trip for supplies. Conversation stopped when she entered the general store. The shopkeeper who had previously greeted her with respect now served her with nervous efficiency. Some customers left rather than share the space with someone who had become controversial. "Heard you've been stirring up trouble," commented Mrs. Hartwell, the banker's wife, loud enough for other customers to hear. "Some folks think certain people should know their place and keep to it." The message was clear. Celeste's challenge to the established order had made her a target not just for Blackwood, but for anyone who benefited from maintaining current power structures. That evening, Jacob found Celeste packing her few belongings into a worn traveling bag. "You're leaving. Staying puts you at risk too." Blackwood made that clear. Celeste folded her father's teaching certificate carefully between her dresses. "He can destroy your ranch the same way he's destroyed other people's lives. Where will you go?" "Somewhere I can start over without endangering the people who have helped me." Jacob sat on the edge of the bed, watching her pack with growing determination. "What if there was another way? What if you didn't have to face this alone?" "There's no other way. Blackwood controls the legal system, the business community, and now he's turned public opinion against me." Celeste closed the bag with finality. "Sometimes retreat is the only option that makes sense. My father used to say that problems don't get solved by running away from them. Your father never faced systematic fraud backed by territorial authority." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the front door. Jacob went to investigate and returned with Judge Martha Stern, her official robes replaced by simple traveling clothes that suggested urgent business conducted in secrecy. Judge Martha Stern entered the kitchen with the careful movements of someone accustomed to making decisions that changed lives. Her wire-rimmed spectacles caught the lamplight as she surveyed the organized case files still spread across the table. "Miss Washington, I understand you've been having difficulties with Mr. Blackwood." Celeste remained standing, uncertain whether this visit represented salvation or additional trouble. Jacob positioned himself near the door, ready for whatever might develop from this unexpected meeting. "Judge Stern, I wasn't expecting official company. This isn't an official visit. May I sit?" The judge settled into the kitchen chair and opened a leather portfolio she had carried in. Inside were documents that looked familiar yet different from the territorial papers Celeste had been studying for weeks. "I've been investigating similar debt manipulation cases across 3 territories for the past 8 months. Your work with local families has provided exactly the kind of detailed evidence I've been seeking." Celeste felt the room shift around her. "You know about the cases I've been helping with?" "I know about all of them. The Martinez family, Mr. Thompson, the widow Patterson, 12 others." Judge Stern spread several documents across the table. What you've documented here represents a systematic fraud operation affecting hundreds of families across multiple jurisdictions. The papers showed names, dates, and financial calculations spanning territories from Arizona to New Mexico. The scope was staggering, far beyond what Celeste had imagined possible. How long have you known about this? Federal authorities received complaints starting last year. The pattern was clear, but we lacked local documentation and witness testimony. Judge Stern looked directly at Celeste. We needed someone with your skills and access to build a comprehensive case. Jakob moved closer to the table, studying the federal documents with growing understanding. You've been waiting for someone like her to surface. Someone with legal knowledge, community connections, and the courage to challenge established power structures. The judge's voice carried respect rather than condescension. Miss Washington has provided evidence that makes prosecution possible. Celeste stared at the federal papers, trying to process this revelation. But Blackwood threatened criminal charges for unauthorized legal practice. Mr. Blackwood doesn't have authority over federal investigations. His threats are designed to silence witnesses and protect his operation. Judge Stern pulled out another document. This is a federal witness protection order. It supersedes any territorial charges related to your assistance to defrauded families. The protection order bore official seals and signatures that carried real authority. Celeste read through the legal language carefully, recognizing the power of federal jurisdiction over territorial courts. What exactly are you asking me to do? Testify in federal court. Present your evidence and documentation. Help us prove systematic fraud that crosses territorial boundaries. Judge Stern leaned forward with intensity. Your work has given us the foundation for a case that could shut down this entire operation. Before Celeste could respond, another knock interrupted the conversation. Jakob answered the door and returned with Doc Henry Fairmont, the town physician who had treated her father during his final illness. Doc Fairmont looked nervous and exhausted, carrying a medical bag that seemed heavier than usual. His normally steady hands shook as he set it on the table. Judge Stern said you wanted to see me. Dr. Fairmont has something important to share about medical billing practices in this territory. The doctor opened his bag and pulled out ledgers and files instead of medical instruments. I've been falsifying bills for Silas Blackwood for over 2 years, adding treatments that never happened, inflating medication costs, creating medical emergencies that didn't exist. Celeste felt her breath catch. My father's medical bills. Pneumonia treatment cost $40. I was forced to bill $160 and create fictional follow-up treatments. Doc Fairmont's voice cracked with guilt. Your father received proper care, but the bills were designed to create impossible debt. The confession filled in missing pieces of the larger puzzle. Celeste's personal tragedy was connected to a systematic operation that had destroyed dozens of families through manufactured medical crises. Why are you telling us this now? Because I can't live with what I've done. Blackwood threatened to destroy my practice if I didn't cooperate, but watching him target you for helping people made me realize I had to speak up. Judge Stern added Doc Fairmont's testimony to her growing collection of evidence. With medical fraud documentation, witness testimony, and your financial analysis, we have everything needed for federal prosecution. Celeste studied the faces around the kitchen table. An unexpected alliance had formed in her father's memory and in service to families she barely knew. The weight of responsibility felt different now, supported by institutional authority rather than carried alone. What happens to Blackwood? Federal charges for mail fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering across territorial boundaries. Prison time, financial penalties, restitution to victims. Judge Stern's satisfaction was evident. The entire operation gets dismantled through proper legal channels. And the families he's trapped, all fraudulent debts declared void, seized properties returned, financial restitution where appropriate. The judge gathered her papers with efficiency. Justice served through law rather than vigilante action. Celeste looked at Jakob, who had supported her efforts without fully understanding where they might lead. His steady presence had made everything else possible. When do we start? Federal court convenes in 2 weeks. We'll need detailed testimony about your father's case, documentation from all the families you've helped, and coordination with Dr. Fairmont's medical records. What about the licensing charges Blackwood threatened? Witness protection covers all related territorial charges. You'll be testifying as a federal witness, not practicing territorial law. Judge Stern stood to leave. Your education and legal knowledge become assets rather than liabilities. The kitchen fell quiet after the judge departed, leaving Celeste and Jacob alone with the magnitude of what lay ahead. The federal courthouse in Tucson overflowed with families who had traveled from across 3 territories to witness justice they never thought possible. Celeste sat at the witness table wearing her best dress, the same one she had worn to her father's funeral 4 months earlier. Now it represented something entirely different. Judge Stern had arranged for the hearing to be conducted in the largest courtroom available, recognizing that this case affected entire communities rather than isolated individuals. Silas Blackwood sat with his team of lawyers, his confidence visibly shaken by the scope of federal charges and evidence arrayed against him. Celeste took the witness stand with steady steps, her father's teaching certificate and seminary papers officially entered as evidence of her qualifications to interpret legal documents. The irony wasn't lost on her that credentials she had hidden for years were now central to achieving justice. Miss Washington, please describe your analysis of the debt collection practices in Redemption Creek. For 2 hours, Celeste presented her findings with mathematical precision and legal clarity. She explained compound interest violations, documented fraudulent fee structures, and demonstrated systematic patterns of exploitation across dozens of cases. Her seminary education became a weapon of truth wielded with surgical accuracy. The Martinez family watched from the gallery as Celeste detailed how their son's $50 medical bill had been transformed into a $200 debt through illegal practices. Carlos squeezed his wife's hand as federal prosecutors presented evidence that would restore their financial freedom. Old Mr. Thompson nodded approvingly as Celeste explained how mortgage modification fraud had nearly cost him his farm. The widow Patterson dabbed tears from her eyes, finally understanding how her husband's funeral expenses had been deliberately inflated to trap her family in impossible debt. Doc Fairmont testified after Celeste, his medical records providing devastating evidence of systematic billing fraud coordinated with debt collectors. His voice remained steady as he detailed the pressure campaign that had forced him to participate in destroying families through manufactured medical crises. I falsified bills for 43 families over 24 months. The total fraudulent charges exceeded $8,000. His confession filled the courtroom with shocked silence. Every case followed the same pattern of inflated costs and fictional treatments. Silas Blackwood's defense team attempted to challenge the evidence through technical objections and jurisdictional arguments, but the documentation was overwhelming. Federal prosecutors had built an airtight case that spanned multiple territories and demonstrated clear patterns of interstate fraud. When the defense called no witnesses, the outcome became inevitable. Judge Patricia Morrison, the federal magistrate overseeing the case, delivered her ruling with the authority of someone who understood the broader implications of systematic exploitation. The evidence demonstrates willful fraud designed to trap families in cycles of debt through illegal practices. Mr. Blackwood and his associates are found guilty of federal fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering charges. The courtroom erupted in restrained celebration as families realized their nightmare was ending through legal justice rather than continued suffering. Celeste felt her father's presence in that moment, his belief in education and law finally vindicated through his daughter's testimony. Blackwood received 5 years in federal prison plus financial penalties that would strip away his accumulated wealth. His business associates faced similar sentences, and the entire debt collection operation was ordered dismantled under federal supervision. More importantly for the affected families, all fraudulent debts were declared void. Properties seized through illegal foreclosure were ordered returned to their rightful owners. Restitution payments would compensate victims for financial losses and emotional suffering. Judge Morrison addressed Celeste directly before closing the proceedings. Miss Washington, your legal analysis and community advocacy have served justice in the finest tradition of American law. Have you considered formal admission to legal practice? The question hung in the courtroom air, representing possibilities Celeste had never dared imagine. Her seminary education and demonstrated skills qualified her for territorial bar admission, but the social barriers had seemed insurmountable until this moment. I would be honored to serve my community through legal practice. Then, I hereby sponsor your application for admission to the territorial bar, with full federal endorsement of your qualifications and character. Judge Morrison's declaration carried the weight of institutional validation. The law needs advocates who understand justice from the perspective of those who need it most. The celebration continued outside the courthouse as families shared their relief and gratitude with the woman who had transformed their lives through courage and knowledge. Celeste found herself surrounded by people whose futures had been restored through careful legal work rather than violence or revenge. Jacob appeared beside her as the crowd began to disperse, his quiet presence a reminder of the partnership that had made everything possible. What happens now? Now I practice law, legitimately, with federal endorsement and community support. Celeste looked toward Redemption Creek in the distance. There's work to be done helping families navigate legal systems designed to exploit their inexperience. Room for a business partner who's good with people but terrible with numbers. The proposal carried deeper meaning than business arrangements. Their shared commitment to justice had evolved into something more substantial than either had expected when Jacob first stepped forward at the auction. Equal partners. In everything. 6 months later, the Washington Morrison Legal Aid Office opened in downtown Redemption Creek, the first law practice in territorial history dedicated exclusively to helping families understand their rights and navigate complex legal challenges. Celeste's father would have been proud to see education and law combined in service to people who needed both most desperately. The small wooden cross marking Samuel Washington's grave now stood beside a thriving community where his daughter had transformed personal tragedy into systematic justice, proving that knowledge shared becomes power multiplied across generations.